Back on the Young Turks. I'm your host, Cenk Uygur. Now we're going to talk to Professor Larry Lessig. He's at Harvard Law School, and he's co-founder of Change Congress. And there's some terrific news about Change Congress I want to talk to him about as well. But, of course, we're going to talk about Elena Kagan to start with. Professor Lessig, welcome back to the Young Turks.
Great to be here.
Great to have you here. Actually, that news about Change Congress and the donor strike is fantastic. I want to get to that next, if we could.
Sure.
But let's start with Elena Kagan. I got to be honest with you. I'm in the skeptical camp, but I really want to hear you out on this. One, you say you know her and that she's a progressive. What can we take out of that, not knowing the private conversations you guys had?
Well, you know, there's no way that you're going to know everything that she said or argued about in the context of being a law professor, arguing in front of other colleagues, all the private ways in which people engage. And the question is, how significant should that fact be? Now, you know, if you're going to decide to appoint non-judges to the Supreme Court, then you're going to always be appointing people who don't have the same kind of on-the-record explanation of their views that judges have. And so, you know, you might decide you don't want any judges on the non-judges on the Supreme Court. I think that's a terrible mistake. I think one of the reasons the court made its idiotic decision in Citizens United was that there was no practical politician types like O'Connor or even Rehnquist sitting on the court at the time they made the decision. And so if you think about, for example, a lawyer in a law firm, like I think of a 20-year younger David Boies, he too would be a person who wouldn't have a full exposition of his positions on the record available for people to review.
Right. Now, that's true, but you're telling me why we don't know anything about her. But what I'm trying to figure out is, what can we know about her? So is there something that you guys, conversations you've had that you could share with us to kind of alleviate the concerns about her progressive nature? Or do you feel uncomfortable doing that because, it's going to be used against her if she's a progressive?
No, I mean, I think that there's pieces that are clearly out there in the public, and there are pieces which are not so clearly in the public, but obviously public. So let's start with pieces that are in the public. First of all, the presidential piece that she wrote in 2001, which has been radically mischaracterized by a whole bunch of people as being a piece that supports the way Bush-Cheney thought of the president's power, meaning that the president has a constitutional right to control the executive branch and to even disregard statutes of Congress that are inconsistent with his conception of the executive branch. That's radically not what Elena's piece said. Elena's piece talked about a president who, because Congress allows him to be, has the authority to aggressively exercise the power of the administration to make the government do the work the government's supposed to do. Now, you know, progressives are interested in the government solving a bunch of important problems and doing so effectively. And this was a map for what you could call the statutory unitary executive, for exactly how the executive branch could play that role consistent with the power of Congress to set limits on that. I think that's an important conception of progressive politics.
Can I pause there for a second, because I want to ask you about that. Because, you know, we had Glenn Greenwald on the program yesterday, and I'm sure you've read what he wrote on it. And when I asked him about this particular issue, he said, look, does the president have the power that Congress has given him? Of course he does. So that's not really the issue. The issue that Elena Kagan was writing about is where it's unclear, and then the president expands his authority vis-a-vis Congress. Do you think that's an accurate description of...
No, that's not an accurate description.
And I might be, by the way, don't quote me as quoting Glenn accurately either, but that's the sense that I got from him. So tell me what your analysis of that is.
Yeah, the critical difference is whether ultimately, the difference between the conception of the president that Cheney-Bush had and the conception of the president that Elena is describing. The critical difference is whether Congress ultimately calls the shots. And in the context of what Elena was describing, she was describing how the Clinton administration was actually functioning, but it was functioning in a way that the president was exercising directory control over many of the agencies by a kind of statutory default. But she expressly says in that paper that if Congress says no, then that's the end of the matter. And under the Bush-Cheney doctrine, If the Congress says no, that's not the end of the matter. They believe there's a constitutional power for the president to trump the decisions of Congress, even where Congress intervenes.
No, I want to be clear on that. We're all on board on that. Nobody's saying that she's the same as Bush and Cheney doctrine on executive power. I don't think Glenn's saying that. I'm not saying that. I haven't heard anybody else saying that. The question was she for broader executive power than what was before and vis-a-vis Congress? And it seems that she is for a little broader executive power. Doesn't mean you ignore Congress. I mean, yeah, if she said that, then nobody would be on her side.
Right, but the question is, what do you mean by vis-a-vis Congress? Because if Congress is ultimately deciding how broad the executive power is by, either allowing the president to act in this way or acting to stop it, then it's not vis-a-vis Congress. It is in concert with Congress. It is what Congress is ultimately saying. And that's what distinguishes it from the Bush-Cheney doctrine. So sometimes Glenn is careful about this. Sometimes he's just flat wrong about this. In the Democracy Now! 2 days ago, he expressly said that it was that her doctrine was it was the president instead of Congress that was setting the policy. That's just not true. The doctrine is it's the president that is being allowed to set the policy so long as Congress doesn't do anything different. But my point is that's describing an extremely effective, aggressive presidential authority that is necessary to execute, get the bureaucracy to do what the bureaucracy is supposed to do. And if progressives want government to regulate effectively, this is a way to get them to regulate effectively.
All right. So I want to let you
that's one area.
You're right. I want to let you get on to area number 2.
So area number 2 is the First Amendment. She's a scholar of the First Amendment. She's mapped out conceptions of the First Amendment, gives a very clear sense of what the boundaries are for government regulation. That's actually been complemented by her work as the lawyer arguing the case in Citizens United for the government to uphold the power of Congress to regulate in that context. In that case, she advanced a new theory of what would justify, or modification of a theory of what would justify Congress's power here. I thought that was actually a stronger theory than had existed in the case law before. The court rejected it, but it's a clear conception, in my view, of a progressive understanding of what the Constitution allows or requires in the context of limitations on the government's power to regulate speech and permissions for the government to regulate to protect against that kind of corruption. Those are the things she's expressly written about. The things that, is just known by anybody who's ever watched her participate is in the context of equal protection. She taught these courses. She was active in the environment of the law school, teaching and talking about these issues of sex equality, gender, sexual orientation equality, all of the dimensions of equality that are extremely important in the context of progressive politics. She's flatly there. So the only place people point, I think, effectively to raise a question is in this area of whether she's a Bush-Cheneyite in the context of presidential power. But again, that's back to where we started in the beginning. I think it's just a misconception of what she's actually written.
Well, Professor Lessig, I'll tell you what concerns me the most in that area is not what she wrote in 01, but her interaction with Lindsey Graham in the hearings, where she seemed to agree to the really broad scope of detention and what the battlefield is in the fight against terrorism, et cetera. Did that concern you at all, or what's your thoughts on her statements in that regard?
Well, again, let's understand, in the context of those questions being asked, we have a Congress that is cooperating with the president. So Congress has defined a certain amount of powers the president has, and those powers are, from my view, wildly broader than what they should be, but that's the powers the government has defined. So when she says, this is what the law is, what she's talking about is not the president's power, George Bush's power vis-a-vis Congress. She's talking what the government of the United States has decided it wants the scope of its authority to be. Now, it's just the case that we don't have in our Constitution a very strong tradition of protecting foreigners on foreign soil against the United States acting arbitrarily. We just don't have that protection. I wish we did, but we don't. So, however uncomfortable it is to accept, there is no doctrine in the United States law right now that's going to step back from the wildly expansive terrorist laws that the United States government, not the president, has adopted. Now, it would be a different question if you had the president asserting certain powers, for example, the power to torture. And Congress saying, we don't want you to have the power to torture. We're passing the statute and say you can't torture. And for her to then say, well, I believe the president has the power to torture, that's essentially what some in the Bush administration thought. But again, that's flatly inconsistent with her view of the scope of executive authority, because the scope of executive authority there is going to be cabined by how broadly Congress has allowed the executive to act. So this is not about executive power in the context in which she was testifying. It's about the government, the United States government's claim to power, which, unfortunately, especially for I think progressives with a conscience, unfortunately, is much broader than it otherwise should be.
Do you agree that during the hearings that she needs to answer these questions a little bit more clearly, and that she should go on the record and not be shy and not be evasive on these questions?
Yeah, so because of who I know her to be, I wish she were, because the people I care about, I want them to have the same confidence in her that I have. But, let's not be... we liberals are pretty good at defeating our own purposes by the kind of naive way in which we play politics in Washington. Let's not be so naive as to believe that there isn't another side here who's going to try to use every opportunity they can. They don't care so much about defeating Elena Kagan as they do about wounding President Obama's administration. So, my view, I understand I have more reason to be confident about this than anybody who doesn't necessarily know her, but my view is she has exactly the right values, and she's going to be, for a reason we haven't even yet talked about, enormously effective as a justice. I think the important thing is getting her confirmed. The important thing is not so much to allay the anxieties of ordinary people. I think those are going to be allayed, in my view, once we see how she is as a justice. So my preference, of course, is that she could be as transparent as she could possibly be. But I'm, not. I don't. It's above my pay grade to know what the right way to play the politics of a Senate confirmation process.
We're talking to Professor Larry Lessig. He is professor of law at Harvard Law School and a co-founder of Change Congress. So let's get to the core argument you have on her effectiveness. You think she'll be able to pull some conservatives onto her side on the Supreme Court. I have to be honest with you. As much as I respect your opinions on 98% of things, I guess you must only be talking about Kennedy, because there's no way in the world she's going to pull Clarence Thomas, Scalia, Alito, or Roberts in her direction. You can't. You don't think that, do you?
No, but I think the magic number in the Supreme Court is 5, right? And that's why I think it's incredibly important to recognize we are appointing the 4th justice, not the 5th justice. So, I love Pam Karlan, for example. She's an amazing law professor. She's been out there as clear and as strong about, constitutional law issues as any progressive could possibly be. But if you were to appoint somebody like Pam Karlan to the Supreme Court, who came in all guns blazing about her, she's kind of an equivalent of Clarence Thomas on the left, she would have no effectiveness in the context of persuading somebody like a Kennedy. That's why, I think there was actual brilliance, and I've been, as you know, a big skeptic about this administration. I think there was real brilliance in recognizing why it was important to have somebody like Kagan who could go in without this clear, I'm a leftist or whatever picture painted on her robe, and therefore, not be able to build the rapport that's necessary to begin to win over a court and begin to shift the direction.
But we're only talking about Kennedy, right? Because there's no way she's going to convince the other 4. So is this strategy all centered on Kennedy?
I don't understand what the word "only" in that statement is.
Okay.
Only is what 5 votes require to get a decision, a majority of the court. So, yeah, of course it's about how to persuade Justice Kennedy. And it's about somebody who can begin to build that rapport and dynamic to enable that to happen.
Finally, on that note, Professor Lessig, I'm concerned that she's going to pull an Obama and that she's going to pull a Democratic Party. That in order to prove how centrist she is, to, appeal to those conservatives on the court, to build consensus, that she's going to go over to their side a couple of times, and that when it comes time for them to come to her side, she'll run into a brick wall. That's my concern.
So I share with you the frustration about Obama playing a game like that. Having just watched the way the court functions, both from the outside and relative inside as a clerk, that's just not the dynamic of the institution. The dynamic of the institution, the thing that was so striking to me when I was clerking was to watch the total ineffectiveness of people like Scalia, in particular Scalia, to persuade anybody because of his extreme bullying kind of manner. I mean, he's sweet and charming and brilliant, but he brooked no compromise in the context of advancing his particular position. And the people he turned off were exactly the targets that that you're going to need to cobble together a majority. And you cobble together a majority not by trading, horse trading. That's not the game. You do it by building integrity and showing respect and engaging in the long-term game of what it is to become a good colleague. And that's what the opportunity of a 50-year-old justice who has the right values, who plays that type of interaction well. Which of all the skepticism about Elena Kagan, nobody doubts this. I think is the real opportunity for this to be a transformative justice. I don't think this is a good justice. I think this is going to be one of the best justices the Supreme Court, most important justices the Supreme Court has had. And I respect everybody for their skepticism, especially against the background of an administration that has not delivered to the progressive side as the progressives expected. I understand all that skepticism, and I don't have a way to prove you out of that skepticism. But I do think we have to keep our eyes focused on the objective, which is how to get to number 5.
All right. Now, in the context of what you just mentioned, we do have terrific news today from Change Congress, among other groups, about a donor strike. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so we test ran this idea a year ago, and now we're going to run it really full force in the context of the election. The basic idea is people pledge not to give money to any candidate who hasn't committed to the Fair Elections Now Act, which means committed to citizen-funded elections, so that the Fair Elections Now Act says no more than $100 in contributions, and that gets matched by the government 4-to-1. And there's about 150 co-sponsors for that bill right now in the House. But the point is, these donors say, we're not going to give you money if you're not supporting this. Now, we started with some of the largest donors, and this was really astonishing to me. You have people like Edgar Bronfman, who, of course, has enormously important reasons to be able to exercise his influence to push policymakers in the direction he wants policymakers to go, and has exercised that influence over the past 20 years for his whole family. But he's one of the leaders, one of the wealthy and powerful people in our country who has said, I don't want this power. I am pledging not to give money to anybody who doesn't support a system that would basically take away my power. I would be like any other citizen out there. And there have been, a large number of these large contributors who have done this, people including like J.J. Abrams, or Jonathan Soros, Arnie Hyatt, Alan Hassenfeld, people who have traditionally used their wealth in a way that has tried to advance policy are now saying we don't want to play that game anymore. So we announced that on Monday, and we launched a site to begin to invite the rest of us to be able to make the same pledge. So you can go to our site, fixcongressfirst.org, and you can make the pledge, and we're beginning to collect a large number, which is basically withheld from the political system to anybody who is not supporting fair elections.
I think it's the number one issue, and I think that you fight money with money. And if you've got these, in this case, 27 of the largest donors in the country saying, I'm not going to give you any more money until you agree to fix Congress first, I think that's a great, great start. And I'm happy to see Change Congress, obviously, leading the way on that. Professor Lessig, thank you so much for joining us on the Young Turks.
My pleasure.
Really appreciate
Thank you very much.